a listener production. Talking about consent or even hearing about it may be triggering for some people. This includes those who have experienced or are experiencing sexual violence or other forms of trauma. Support is available at 1-800-RESPECT, National Domestic, Family and Sexual Violence Counselling Service, and information is also available at Consent.gov.au. Hi, Sasha Barbagat with you for episode 4 of this 4-part series of The Briefing, brought to you in conjunction with the federal government's campaign Consent Can't Wait. Statistics show 1 in 5 women and 1 in 16 men have experienced sexual violence since the age of 15. 1 in 2 women and 1 in 4 men have experienced sexual harassment. A separate study found 64% of non-binary people, 55% of trans men, and 42% of trans women had experienced sexual assault. ABS data released this year shows that for victims and offenders of sexual assault, the most common age for the incident to occur is between 10 and 17 years old. Young people aged between 10 and 17 make up 41% of all victims of sexual assault, the majority of whom are female. It's a lot more than no means no, so clearly it is time to talk about consent. Jude Bolton is host of Triple M's Rush Hour program in Sydney, and he's a former Sydney Swan, winning 2 premierships in his more than 300 first grade games. He's also a father to 2 young daughters, aged 12 and 10, and also needs to consider how he presents consent to them. Jude, welcome to The Briefing. And first off, commiserations for the Sydney Swans the other week.
Yeah, still hurting a little bit, Sash.
Look, you're the father to 2 young daughters, as we just heard, which no doubt keeps you incredibly busy. And in the hustle and bustle of parenting, you need to find time, I guess, to address consent. Normalising conversations around it means we can all be on the same page when it comes to our understanding. How have you found dealing with that as a dad to kids who are coming up to teenage years?
Yeah, so my oldest daughter's 12 and just turns 13 in January. My youngest daughter's just turned 10. And like my wife and I, we're realising that we can have these conversations sooner rather than later because we're already going into that experience of birthday parties and things where there's big groups of people, pickups at 10:30 and the like. And, we're not going to know everyone at that particular party. So we're sort of big on the circle of friends, and I'm certainly no expert. I sort of trust the experts in this sort of space, but having a good circle of friends that can look out for each other and for her to understand that if she doesn't feel safe in any particular, if it doesn't feel right in a certain situation, well, she can reach out to either of us and to always know that we're there for her at any particular point. But Chanel Contos is obviously an expert and literally wrote the book on consent. And yeah, let's take a listen.
We need to have explicit conversations with young people about what consent is, what not consent is, what this means. We need to embed empathy in the way that they engage in sexual situations so that this isn't some confusing thing they have to, call back on their PDHP lesson, but an inherent trait in themselves that they would never put their own sexual entitlement above the desires of another person.
Yeah, which I think is interesting because consent has been framed as something that might be too hard to handle, but really it's just an expansion on conversations we've had with kids for a really long time. Things like keeping them safe at school or when they go to the playground. Like it's just an expansion of what we already understand about consent, isn't it?
Absolutely. That's just taking it to the next level. And certainly, already having discussions with my 9-year-old and a 10-year-old around just that feeling of safety danger and stranger danger and the like. But this is now the next stage. So, for me, it just feels like we need to have these conversations so they feel informed, they feel empowered. And then from there, they can base their own decisions. They're going to be making their own decisions, but just do it informed and say, okay, I'm basing this on a conversation I've had with mum and dad or at school as well and around their friends as well. So I sort of look back and I lean on some of the friendships that I have with friends that have daughters a little bit more advanced, maybe 15, 16. And so I can sort of lean on that and just have a conversation and say, how would I approach this with them? Because that helps me then have a tougher conversation with them.
Yeah, and I think we talked before we hit record about how different it is. I mean, for me even, I'm 20 years older than your eldest daughter, and these conversations were not being had when I was a teenage girl, and I wish they had. And it's wonderful that now parents like yourself are having to have those conversations and having them in a positive way.
I mean, it's come so far since I grew up and I was in an all-boys school and that was just quite different. There was no conversations around consent and safety then. And And I think that's where, come back to sort of Chanel Contos in the sense that she's asking this to be a whole community engagement. And that's not only from potential victims being able to know about safety and harm and consent, but potential perpetrators as well. Like they need to know that their behaviours are unacceptable.
I see it as everyone's responsibility to have these conversations, governments, parents, teachers, and definitely the private sector to use their kind of resources and reach and brand trust to elevate this message.
Yeah, and I believe the key word there is everyone, and that's what this campaign is all about, bringing together all members of the community to make Australia safer for all Australians. The whole community needs to be engaged. Times are changing, and we as a community collectively need to change too. That's why we are, and we have been through this series, trying to dispel some of the myths around consent. And here's another one. Talking to kids about sexual consent will lead to, risky behaviour.
Yes, I don't agree with that. I think kids make their own decisions and the like, but I mean, just being able to have those, an opportunity to have a safe space and be able to have a discussion around this, just it elevates them. Kids want to feel empowered. They want to feel more independence. So it's just having a bit of a framework for them. So we've started to have those conversations with our oldest daughter, and even my youngest daughter just being able to work through. She's certain on some online sort of stuff as well. So talk us through this chat room. Who's in this particular area and things like that. So it's something that we're all just sort of quite new to it, and I'm just trying to find my way through it.
Yeah, that's such a great point. And you can have age-appropriate conversations about consent with young people at any time. And, the federal government, as part of this campaign, says that having open dialogue around things like sex and dating and relationships actually supports young people's well-being and delays sexual activity until they feel ready, which is, the key point here. And providing this positive info can really help develop mutually respectful relationships, and then that goes on to prevent harm. But before we talk to young people, we do need to focus on talking among adults first, which also brings us, Jude, to the P word, pornography. Now, statistics show 2 in 5 young women and 3 in 5 young men have reported using porn as a source of information to learn about sex. What is the idea around how we're approaching pornography now? Has it changed a lot?
I think it has. I think certainly, there's so much online that kids are just being shown and seen, and I think it doesn't matter on any platform. There's always a chance that they're going to somehow come across that and be shown that. So I think first and foremost, it comes back to that conversation with your kids to say you're not in trouble if you've seen something, but being able to have a safe space where they can say, okay, how did you feel when you saw that? Was that shared to you by certain someone or the like? And then being just able to say, okay, it's not real life. Like you're looking for mutually respectful relationships, and that doesn't signify real life in any point. So
yeah.
I think, it comes back to that online spaces. They're getting shared memes, they're getting shared videos. Doesn't matter if you're on your settings aren't right on YouTube, for instance. They're suddenly being shown that, and I think you just need to have that age-appropriate conversations and content for those kids.
Well, Jude, the new Consent Campaign website has some really great resources to help parents navigate these conversations, but also help children develop critical thinking to understand that pornography is not real life, which I think leads really nicely to the importance of consent in the digital world, which is a whole other aspect of this conversation.
Online stuff it's quite shocking, the statistics and what people are seeing, and I think it comes back to that fact that it's not real life at some stage when they're seeing the different pornography and the like online. This is just such a key area that kids need to be informed about and educated about. So that's certainly something that my wife and I are taking upon ourselves to know, because online activities have real life consequences as well. And I was lucky enough and fortunate enough to have discussions at the Sydney Swans back in the day to say, look what can happen online, and being aware of that and saying, okay, this could have real-life consequences is really important.
And I think understanding as well, just as much as we need to as adults, that what happens on the online world is actually real life as well. It's not make-believe. And as you said, what happens there can have these real-life consequences. And it's important for children to know the consequences of sending unsolicited sexually explicit content to other people and encourage them to talk to an adult if they've seen something inappropriate online. And as important is actually educating them on the consequences of sharing porn or a person's sexual images without their permission, or even pointing out, non-consensual situations in TV shows or movies, in music, and explaining the reasons why. But let's leave the final word to Chanel Contos, who talks about what we can all learn from the way we educate children.
If you kind of think back to really young kids and how we can teach these concepts of consent and how to engage with other people in a healthy way. We can teach kids concepts of consent by talking about playing with toys, giving permission to share those things, teaching them to ask permission if they're going to braid each other's hair or hold each other's hand. And not only teaching them to ask, but also teaching them to say no. And then also, more importantly, teaching them how to respect a no. Because if that's common practice from a young age, then by the time they get older and they learn about sex and they get consent thrown in as part of their sex education, these concepts already make sense to them, and they may not take a no as a kind of personal rejection, but more of an understanding of what another person wants in that moment.
And I think that's a great message for us to finish on. And I think you're doing such a great job having that important chat with your kids as well, Jude. Thanks so much for your time.
Thanks, Sasha.
That was Jude Bolton, co-host of Triple M Sydney's Rush Hour program and former dual premiership player with the Sydney Swans. And if you'd like to know more about consent, how to have conversations, or to equip yourself with the tools to help educate someone else, check your understanding and go to consent.gov.au. That's consent.gov.au. That is it for today's episode. And just a reminder, this is the last episode of our 4-part series on consent in partnership with the federal government as part of its Consent Can't Wait campaign. Thank you for listening. I'm Sasha Barbagat. Catch you next time.